Assalamu alaikum and peace be with you. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. You can always watch us on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, and on our own website, muslimnetwork.tv. We're also available on Roku, YouTube, and Facebook, and pretty soon we'll be there on Apple TV as well. It's just amazing that whole country is standing up for Black Lives Matter. And now different people, even some corporation, are getting into action. But then there are other people who are not quite happy about it. There was a CNN story this morning that a known white supremacist created a fake account on Twitter and he started putting out violent messages. Only that Twitter found out about it. Before that, President's son has shared it with his millions of followers. Look at what extremists and something called Intifa. I don't know what is that. Well, I know what is that, but who are they? I don't know. So it is the conversation in the country about what is happening. To discuss that with us is Prof. Ayesha K. Mustafaa. Ayesha K. Mustafaa has been the longest lasting editor of the Weekly Muslim Journal, which has been the longest publishing Muslim journal in America. She is the third woman editor in nearly 45-year-old newspaper and its longest tenured editor. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Sister Ayesha.
Thank you, Brother Mujahid, and it's a great pleasure to join with you again in another project.
All right. Ayesha has traveled throughout the world as in delegation led by Imam W. Muhammad. May Allah's peace and mercy be on him. She has been to Saudi Arabia, Riyadh multiple times, and Jeddah, Mecca, Palestine. Most notably, during one of her meeting with Imam W. Muhammad, she also met Palestinian President Yasser Arafat. Well, that need to be another show, I guess.
Yeah.
But a pleasure for me is that she has been one of the inaugural original host of the Daily Radio Islam in Chicago on WCV 1450 AM, which I had the honor of launching and being its executive producer, which now have merged into Muslim Network TV. And she moved to Jackson, Mississippi. You need to be back in Chicago, sister.
Well, we'll be two cities.
Okay.
Two cities.
All right. So what I hear is a lot of people have higher level of anxiety. I mean, we feel for the person murdered in this brutal way.
Mm.
And everybody knows police murdered it. Even his wife has decided to divorce him and change her name.
Mm.
But police continue to use violence to stop the protest, which is against the police violence. So this irony, do you think this irony going to help people in some way?
Well, but for the camera, this would have gone on as another African-American who rose up against the police and was justifiably killed in the line of police duty. But when it's caught on camera and it's so starkly evident that this man was murdered in broad daylight, it has impacted people in more of a different way, even more so than Eric Garner, who also said, "I can't breathe," while he was tussled to the ground by a host of policemen. There have been other murders even there in Chicago, when you had the McDonald case, the young boy who was walking down the street just
Yes.
carrying a knife,
Shot 15 times.
16, shot 16 and then the officers went to all the businesses in that area and confiscated all of the surveillance cameras. The city paid that family restitution for that murder. And it was 2 years later that a journalist filed a Freedom of Information Act to get those records from the police department and showed evidence that this young man was murdered by homicide by a out of control police officer, and his fellow officers covered up for him. In this case, it was self-evident because the camera was there, and this will make a difference. It has made a difference worldwide. We've seen protests in London. We've seen protests in South Africa. We've seen protests in Berlin. And people say enough is enough. And Imam Mujahid, it is amazing that our African-American brother who was murdered was saying, I can't breathe. And we're in the middle of a pandemic where African-Americans all over the country are saying, I can't breathe because of the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus within the African-American community. So a lot of issues have been raised that can't be, again, swept under the rug, can't be just dismissed. And I don't think the good-hearted, conscious people of all races, all nationalities are going to let that happen this time.
So in Chicago, the death rate of African American is double of their population in the coronavirus.
Yes.
In the essential services, poorest of the labor are post office, mail person, and all that. None of them have any protective equipment. I see every day they have nothing to protect themselves. At the top of it, the 40 million plus people who have become unemployed, a large number of them were poorer job, not the ITs, not the big shots, but the smaller number of people, poor people. And at the top of it, we have repeated police violence in different cities. So people are protesting. I mean, I was part of the protest when we counted 1 shot, 2 shot, all the way up to 16 shots. And our mayor, who is African American, she promised a whole lot of things, and none of those things are happening. Then on Saturday, I was part of the march. It was extremely peaceful march. I mean, there were 20,000 people and in cars and with social distancing. I mean, I was protecting myself as well. And it was extremely peaceful. But instead of focusing in the peacefulness, later on at the end of the day or somewhere, some people started using violence and attack. Now, there are different theories about that violence. But what are the lessons today's protesters need to learn from the history of protest? I mean, you have been a journalist for long, and you being African American and being a Muslim, the whole knowledge base right there with you, Sister Ayesha Mustafaa. What are the lessons today's protesters? Because I'm going out tomorrow again. I'm going to be part of the march. So what are the lessons for today's protesters about this inhumanity towards other human beings, which we notice?
Brother Mujahid, unfortunately, this is not our first time being in this situation, in this predicament, where we have to have nationwide protests. I think the first thing is to know who you are joining. It is very important to have organized protests. It is very important to have a structure. It is important to have an agenda, to have a roadmap of where you're starting and where you intend to end. And therefore, scrutinize those people who come into your ranks or come into your camp according to your agenda, and everybody knows what that is. Now, you know, in the news, one of the violent protesters that went to Minneapolis has been arrested because he posted on Facebook that he was going there with the intent to create violence, and he was encouraging other people to come with him. So he's been arrested on federal charges. The nonviolent protests, as in the history or in the name of Dr. Martin Luther King, they have an organized agenda, and those things need to be revisited and looked at. They didn't just spring up out of nowhere. They had objective, and they stuck to that. And Dr. King's motivation of nonviolence was very important. Now, I know a lot of young people even have said to me, I'm not for nonviolence anymore. You hit me, I'm going to hit you back. We tried that already. But if they look at history and they look at what's happening now, you have to have a specific agenda and a track record in order for you to make progress. We're not just out to fight the police and to die on the streets. There is a outcome to this that is perceived and you want to achieve.
You know, I'd like to share with you the first protest I participated in Chicago was in Delhi Plaza in the city of downtown Chicago. And it was in 1981 or 1982 when different properties belonging to Elijah Muhammad was being taken over by the government, and it was being organized by African American Muslims. So that was my first ever protest in Chicago.
Okay, yes, we remember that quite well. Muhammad told us that was when he was transitioning from the Nation of Islam, and those properties really became an attack on the Nation of Islam's strength. And so they were being contested in court. The people who brought lawsuits against the community for those properties were saying they were personal properties of theirs and not the organizations or the communities. It's like a minister's family coming in and saying, this church property is mine. You worshipers sitting out there, that's well and good. You gave your donations and you helped buy it, but it was in the name of my Reverend Father. So therefore it's my personal property to be an heir to inherit. And that's what came against the Imam Muhammad when he was transitioning out of the Nation of Islam. And it was really a tactic to weaken the Nation of Islam, because some of the laws that were used against the community were not even on the books in inheritance laws until 1975, after the death of Elijah Muhammad. So yes, and we have a long-standing history of protests and organizing. And again, we find ourselves here today, but I think we're making progress. You know, Dr. King would say, justice is slow, but the arch always bends towards justice. So we expect that we are still making progress, however slow it might appear.
Well, I just told you that was my first protest. Dates of my dates may be a little messy because I remember two incidents. This was one I participated. Other one, either it was before that or at the same time, was I had a friend, preacher. He was a African American, and at the University of Chicago, he was a PhD student, and he used to be a Greek Orthodox priest, but he reverted back to Islam. And in the library where I used to sit, a white girl pointed out that he stole my TV. And they just arrested him. No evidence, nothing. They just arrested him. And this guy was anti-technology. He didn't ever care even for phone. He didn't have a phone in his home either. In those days, there were no cell phone anyway. But he didn't care for phone. He didn't care for TV or anything. And it took us a lot of marches and trip to Cook County Prison and long time to get him released, just because somebody pointed out he stole my TV. So when we come back after this short break, Ayesha Mustafaa, I want to talk to you about your personal experiences. How many television have you stolen from my home?
Well,
That-
as you go into break, keep in mind the young white girl that was in Central Park who called the police on the African American who was a bird watcher recently. And she began to get hysterical, saying that this black man, this African American man, is threatening her because he.
I mean, she told him that I'm going to tell this to 911, 911.
911. So we saw it play it out again right in front of our eyes. So
Yeah.
things are changing.
During the threat, and then at the end, she become really hysterical, trying to call.
She's a good actress.
That was something.
Yeah.
You're watching Mujahid Talk at Muslim Network TV, and this is Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Ayesha Mustafaa. Ayesha K. Mustafaa used to be host of Radio Islam, but she has been keeping up the flag of the only Muslim weekly, longest lasting Muslim weekly, Muslim Journal alive. We'll be right back after these messages.
You can't come in here.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Mujahid Talks. We're always there on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, as well as Roku TV, and on our website, Muslim Network TV, and of course on YouTube and Facebook Media. I'm talking with Ayesha Mustafaa. Ayesha Mustafaa is editor of Muslim Journal Weekly, and she has been the longest serving editor of that since January 1989. Ayesha, share with us. I mean, statistics is one thing, but personal experience is something different. Share with us your personal experiences of being an African American. And sometime my friend tell me being African American is one, being a woman is the second one, and being a Muslim woman is the third one. So share some of your personal experiences with us.
Brother Mujahid, well, I have to go back in a little bit of history lesson, even before my time.
Yes.
Because the African American experience goes back to the days of slavery. And that's a era and a period in and of itself. And coming out of that period of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation, there is a running program now about Ulysses S. Grant as the general for the Civil War under President Lincoln, and just the personalities of these people who went to war in the Civil War, that in essence would bring an end to actual physical slavery. First, the U.S. banned slavery trade. They banned the ships. It was unlawful to transport slaves. Then it took a while for them to actually make it unlawful to have slaves. And it took a civil war for that to be implemented. And even then, after the war was over, some parts of the country, it took 2 years for the Africans who were enslaved to learn that they had been freed.
Oh, that's where the Juneteenth comes in, right?
That's Juneteenth in Texas. Texas was 2 years out from freeing the slaves, and when they found out, they began to celebrate, and it was in June. It was actually June 19th. So they had a celebration called Juneteenth for the freeing of the slaves, and that was the official celebration, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed 2 years earlier. But there's a lot of history in the U.S. People who look for loopholes have loopholes. Even in the 13th Amendment, that frees Africans, frees individuals, people, period, from slavery. There's that loophole except for criminal acts and indentured servitude. Now,
Yes,
if you
so
come
in
fast
a way,
forward,
preserving the slavery model when you are committing a crime or something, right?
right now, if you fast forward to now, indentured imprisonment, more African Americans disproportionately are imprisoned for crimes of lesser nature than their white counterparts. The prison population actually represents another form of enslavement, not only in terms of physical enslavement, but those who have felons are then disenfranchised. They can't even vote in many places. And then we fast forward to today, where we see people who are actually being framed in their incarceration. But also, my Mississippi history, it's been a long journey. Mississippi didn't sign the Emancipation Proclamation until 2013. It was just laying on somebody's desk, and it hadn't been signed. So it was the last state to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But in our history, when we go back and chronicle history, the first big case that broke the headlines was the murder of Emmett Till, connecting Chicago.
Chicago.
Yeah, a 15-year-old boy was visiting his grandparents in Mississippi. And because it was reported that he whistled at a white woman, he whistled. And that's debatable because they say Emmett Till had a list. Anything he said sounded like a whistle. But even then, he was taken out of his grandparents' home in the middle of the night. He was brutally murdered at age 16. Cotton gin was tied around his neck and he was thrown into the river. Weeks went by and they couldn't find him. And then when they finally found his body, it was so distorted and mutilated until when his mother came, Amy Mosley Till, came to Mississippi to identify his body. She could only tell by a mark on his leg. And then when she brought his body back to Chicago for burial, she was warned not to open his casket. But Jet Magazine stepped in. Simeon Booker, then the editor of Jet Magazine, and Mamie Mosley defied those orders and opened the casket. And it went worldwide. And Emmett Till was like a marker. There had been murders a couple of weeks before Emmett Till's murder that didn't make the news, that didn't make any headlines. But when Emmett Till was murdered and his mother put his picture on the front page of Jet Magazine, it changed the attitude. Even Rosa Parks, whom we call the mother of the civil rights movement, and she refused to give up her seat on the bus in the South. Just think of this. And that day after Emmett Till's murder, African Americans did not have the right to sit where they wanted to sit on a bus, even though they boarded it first. And she was told she had to give up her seat for a white passenger. And she refused to get up and she was arrested. And they asked Rosa Parks, were you tired? She was a seamstress. She stood up all day. She was going home. She said, I wasn't tired. She said, I was thinking about Emmett Till. And I just decided I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not getting up anymore.
A little bit of piece of history about Emmett Till. You know that his body was again taken out.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, FBI chief of Chicago told me they took his photos. And his body was more the same way. He looked the same way as he was buried long time ago.
Yeah.
He didn't. I asked him, can I see the photos? He said, no, rules don't allow me to show you, but I have seen it. He looked exactly at the time the way he looked when he was buried there. So just a piece of history, which may not go anywhere, but the FBI chief in Chicago told me that.
Yeah. Yes. And Emmett Till was one murder. Then we have the Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner young men here in Mississippi who were here. Two of them was one white, one Jewish, one African American, Cheney. They were here to help African Americans register to vote. We had to write to vote, but they had to actually go out and campaign to get people to register to vote. And those 3 young men were murdered up in Philadelphia, Mississippi, to the point where the first FBI headquarters in Mississippi was established because of their murder. And the headquarters of the FBI building here in Jackson is named the Cheney, Goodman, Schwerner, and Moore headquarters, because Moore was the FBI agent that was persistent in finding the bodies of those 3 young men. These are people who were in their 20s. These were people who were working in the civil rights movement in their 20s, and they had left the comfort of their homes to come south to assist. So there is a long history of progress and a long history of bloodshed. And that's why we say the price that has been paid for any advances that we made has been too much for us not to continue going forward, even to this point where we are today.
So tell me, what are the possible short-term and the long-term outcome of the ongoing protests today? What do you think in the short term could be achieved, and what could be achieved in the long term?
The short term is for the 4 officers to be charged and prosecuted and found guilty. That's the short term. Those 4 officers that participated, not just the one with his knee, but the other 3 who stood by and permitted those acts to take place. They were officers of the law.
Not only they stood by, 2 of them actually were part of keeping him on the ground. The body weight of 3 officers was on him.
Yeah, you got a different shot. Yeah, the other camera shot did come into play. Yes. And the long term, I think, is for justice reform, not only in the police department, but in the justice system. When we start talking about disproportionate imprisonment of African Americans and disproportionate murder of African Americans at the hands of police officers. We've just touched the surface of how many have occurred. But we can even go back to, I don't know if anybody remembers the beatings of African Americans in Los Angeles, the King beating. There was a riot there also because those officers were let off the hook. Rodney King, when he was caught on tape, and this was before we had cell phones, someone on their balcony just had a video camera and they were recording these police officers mercilessly beating Rodney King because of he was a drunk driving charge, but they didn't just arrest him for drunk driving, they beat him and it was caught on camera. And then they were on their walkie-talkies, their police radios, and laughing about how bad they beat a coon tonight. And then that case, because of a camera catching it, went to trial. Those officers were all let free. They were exonerated in court. And Los Angeles exploded.
Let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, hardly any of these officers are convicted. Why is so? I mean, everybody saw what happened in New York. And now I'm afraid of the same thing in the case of George Floyd. Everybody watched, but the examiner initially said, well, he didn't die because of this, he didn't die because of that, and now he's changing his story. So the people who are themselves responsible for killing somehow has full freedom to manipulate the essential initial record. And that's where everybody goes free. So what is this thing? Are there examples of when conviction was achieved, and what were the lessons of that? Because this is another issue. I mean, when you have video camera, you're caught, you still go get free. Like Rodney King is the case the same?
Yeah. Rodney King finally they received restitution from the city because of wrongful behavior, but the officers were let free. It requires reform in the law enforcement criminal justice system. It requires police federations, police unions, rethinking their protection of each other. They have what they call the blue wall, where there's a code of silence among police officers. No matter what one does, the brotherhood, the sisterhood of the police officers protect that particular person. That has to be changed. The criminal justice system has to be changed. You know, one of the most notorious cities for police brutality is Chicago, where the former commissioner of the police was brought back to Chicago after his retirement to face charges of police brutality.
You're referring to Lieutenant Brudge.
Yeah. And then the thing was, they had the evidence, but they said the statute of limitation had passed, so they couldn't try him anymore because of the statute of limitation. But when those former inmates began to describe the abuse and the torture that they received under him, there shouldn't have been any statute of limitation allowed to him. We know now in murder, there is no statute of limitation. That's why they assume the body immaterial, because even 50 years later, murder is still tribal. You know, there's no statute of limitation. But just like they lifted the statute of limitation on rape, they should also lift it on some of these other crimes, especially when it comes to torture in the custody of police officers. There should be no statute of limitation.
So Brudge was tried and convicted. I think now he died in prison. But can these reform be a part of a federal package, or you need to fight state by state, because then you have the red state and the blue state and all that nonsense comes into play?
Well, we have federal laws and federal offices that can do reform. You have state by state as well, but if the federal government weighs in, they can also bring federal charges, even where they have been state charges. Also, they can revisit a case and see if there have been any federal guidelines that have been violated. And we've seen that in different cases. Even with Trayvon Martin, it was revisited when he was the murder of Trayvon Martin was not convicted, but it was revisited on a federal level to see if his civil rights had been violated. And that's why we also try to include hate crimes, because hate crimes is a federal statute that can also have a federal sentence too. So, but it has to be done on both levels, the federal and the state. And unfortunately, this actually, when I look at the federal government of today, the administration under Donald Trump, honestly, this is the whitest administration I have seen in recent years. Even going back to first President Bush, Bush had African Americans and others within his administration, his upper tier administration. The second Bush had African Americans in his administration. Clinton had African Americans in his administration. Of course, Obama had African Americans in his administration. But here with Donald Trump, it is the whitest, most polarized, right-wing administration that I can recall in my adult years.
So one of the things, Ayesha, I'd like to learn from you, when Black Lives Movement began, and people are wondering who are these leaders. And now there is a huge grassroots movement. I mean, it is not clear who is the leader and who is guiding. So who do you think this movement is leaderless? Do you think this movement is just a grassroots reaction which will go away pretty soon, and all these energies will not be channeled into a long-term change? So how you define the leadership of this moment?
Well, that's in transition also, but I give kudos to Black Lives Matter. When they first started out, it was a little vague in terms of who was in charge and what the purposes were. But as the few years has passed since its origination, their legitimacy is being played out, and their role in the movement itself is there. Of course, there are more than one movement. There are more than one avenue. But usually what would take place is these various organizations, there might be several movements, but these various organizations will have a coalition where they would come together and work in harmony, in cooperation with each other as they move forward on specific issues. There are some movements that are just targeted towards social reform in the terms of our laws, our criminal laws, restoring the disenfranchised felons, ex-felons who have been released, to restore to them their right to vote. They paid their dues, they completed their sentences, but when they are released, they still don't have the right to vote. So there are several avenues, movements taking place. And then we still have what I call the old guard too. You know, we still have Jesse Jackson. We still have other major players who have come up through the ranks, John Lewis, who are still in play. And so I think these various avenues of these various organizations need to be reached out to in terms of founding, establishing that coalition of organizations.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. We're always there on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as on Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and of course on our own website, muslimnetwork.tv, and all the social media. I'm talking with Ayesha Mustafaa, who is editor of Muslim Journal, the longest lasting Muslim journal in America. It's a weekly. And we'll be right back after these messages. Stay with us. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking Ayesha Mustafaa, who is the editor of Muslim Journal. He used to be with one of the original team of hosts at the Daily Radio Islam, which is now merged into Muslim Network TV. And she also serves as the board member of the only Muslim museum, International Museum of Muslim Cultures, based in Jackson, Mississippi. Aisha, where do you see this thing going? I mean, now that rioting and curfews, I mean, several Muslims have lost their businesses and several poor people. And interesting enough, all of them still are standing with the movement, with the protest movement. Many of them have given public statement. One person who in Minneapolis, a Muslim who lost his restaurant to the fire, although fire was not meant to destroy his, but it was somewhere else. It moved on. He was actually providing food to the protesters, and he says, building can be rebuilt, human being cannot be restored, and I support the movement. Another Muslim who has about lost $500,000 worth of inventory is an 80-year-old Muslim. His store even has written Islamic products or something like that. And he still has a big board outside in support of the movement. So people are demonstrating extraordinary support. And now I have seen Citibank and Nike and different companies are coming out with a statement of solidarity. So do you see something is new in terms of enhanced support? Or is it just me, the always a hopeful person there?
I think it's to a boiling point. There is a difference. Even Michael Jordan, who had been so cautious over the years not to make political statements, Even now, Michael Jordan has made a statement of how horrified he was to see George Floyd murdered in broad daylight on video, played on Facebook. So it has come to a boiling point. You know, some people will say, well, maybe this happened, but it didn't reach me. But I think this one particular murder, even more than Eric Garner's murder in New York, who also said, I can't breathe. But George Floyd saying, I can't breathe. And in his last few moments, calling to his mother, people standing on the sideline saying, let him up, just let him get in the car. And they telling him, don't resist. He said, I wouldn't resist. I would get in the car when he could speak. And then the young girl was there also who was videotaping, and she's been maligned. She's been attacked on Facebook as an opportunist. What could you see as an opportunist in that situation when you see someone being manhandled to the point of they telling you I can't breathe? Anyone who was there had to be horrified and frozen in time. They couldn't believe what they were seeing before their very eyes. And I think that's the way this is playing out worldwide. There is an obvious case here that if these people are not prosecuted for the murder of George Floyd, then we are really on a slippery slope downward. And that this will be a turning point. This will be a demarcation of whether we are going forward as a nation as a whole, or whether we are going to descend into chaos and anarchy.
Well, that is another reason for leadership to demonstrate leadership in this issue. These were the moment when President Kennedy took decisive steps, which took the country forward. And unfortunately, that leadership is missing. But one of the concern I have, I'm in Minnesota, these are all Democrats in power. In Chicago, police chief and the mayor, Atlanta, the mayor, I don't know about the police chief. I mean, how come in the cities, at New York, where Democrats are in power, police continues to behave in a way as though they don't care? Or maybe I don't know the story of those police officers. Maybe they are reacting to something which they have been subjected to. But how come, the Democrats who are in control, who are in power, are not demonstrating the type of leadership which can take things forward? Of course, I have found police officers somewhere in Michigan, I don't know where, a police officer came, a sheriff dressed in all that militarized suit with his police army. And he said, what do you want? People told him, just march with us. So he dropped everything, he marched, and everything was fine. People in some cities, some officers, not all officers, some officers have taken a knee and it developed a relationship, empathizing. So how come the democratic leadership of these cities and these states is unable to empathize with people, what I'm feeling? I mean,
well, Brother Mujahid, I think it's going to go beyond party labels, party lines. The Democrats and the Republicans, after every now and then somebody remind us, Abraham Lincoln was Republican. The Republican movement at that time was the one that broke the back of slavery in this country. And here in Mississippi, where we have the great leadership of a lady called Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer started the new Democratic Party in Mississippi because the old Democratic Party would not seat African Americans. And she made her way to the Democratic Convention in Washington, D.C. at the time, and got on the platform and was able to make a pronounced speech. This was a lady who grew up as a sharecropper, but her innate ability to deliver a profound speech on behalf of African Americans here in the South resonated throughout the country. And her favorite saying was, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that was Fannie Lou Hamer. And so the Democratic Party was working against us at that time. And we tried to work our way in. So it goes beyond political labels. We have to look at the content of people's hearts. And again, we have to find like minds and like hearts to work together to break the back of this backward slide that we see happening now with this new administration in place. But we also recognize the people fear change. Even the majority, even the white majority, fears what we call the browning of America, and they feel that they are losing their status as the majority of the status quo, while everyone else is trying to gain their rights and gain their equality. So we see the two efforts playing side by side, but we have to keep understanding that our help might come from unsuspected places, because even here in Mississippi, even in this environment where everything was stacked up to work against the advancement of the African Americans, we know there were even some governors who quietly worked on behalf of establishing the rights of African Americans. Governor Winters, Governor Ray Mabus, these are former governors. But as they moved out of office, they began to talk about what they couldn't do and what they could do because the momentum was just so much against them. Winter said, well, I would have been dead too if I had stepped out any further. Ray Mabus, the first thing he did after his leaving office as a governor, he told the widow of Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was murdered. Going into his house, he was shot down because he was the head of the NAACP and he was working on voter rights. He was murdered in his driveway. He was shot down with his wife and his children inside the house. When Ray Mabus left governorship, he was assigned as the Secretary of the Navy. And he told Medgar Evers' widow, Mary Evers, one day I will make sure Medgar's name is remembered throughout this country. And she says herself, she said, yes, it's just another white promise coming from someone. But when he became Secretary of the Navy, the first thing he did was he commissioned a military ship and he named that ship the Medgar Evers. Usually that's left for generals, retired generals. Medgar Evers did serve in the Navy, but he was not a general. But Ray Mabus reminded and he had Medgar Evers' family and Medgar Evers' widow to come to christen that ship. That's a small gesture, but it lets you know the heart and mind and soul of the people are not always what appears on the surface. Within the context of Mississippi history, he might have looked like he was aiding and abetting the white supremacists because he simply held office. It even goes back, for example, you can go back to the history of that was played out in the movie Schindler's List. A lot of Jews said Schindler cooperated with the Nazis, but at the same time, other Jews said he saved a lot of lives. Maybe he was on the surface cooperating, but behind the scenes, he was saving the lives of Jews. And so we have to ask those people who have that change of heart, who have that mindset. They know it's moving in their soul, that something is wrong here. They just have to be a little bit more bolder. Even if they can't step out front, they at least have to support the movement wherever and whenever they can.
So, you're liberating the conversation from this Republican and Democrat thing, and they're good lessons from the history. But as elections are just around the corner, what is it which our listeners, people who are watching Muslim Network is run by Muslim, but it is a network of peace and justice people, and we talk on the issues which matter to ourselves and our society. What is it people can do now to ensure that no matter which side of the aisle this politician is, they understand what is the issue and they have clear idea what they are going to deliver?
Where we are now with this administration with President Donald Trump, as one person said this morning on the news, the government has been hijacked. Those people who voted for Donald Trump, whatever they thought their gains would be, whatever their fears were, when he appealed to the poor white working class, when he appealed to the coal miners that he was going to bring their jobs back, which they cannot bring back, when he appealed to the white evangelicals that he's going to save Christianity in some kind of bizarre way. These are all false claims from a man who someone pointed out today, he went and stood in front of a church with a Bible, but he never opened the Bible. And he hadn't been frequenting that church.
And somebody asked him, is it your Bible? And he was honest about it. He said, this is Bible. He didn't claim that was his Bible.
I think in history we can go back and find some really bad presidents, some sinister presidents, but we are faced with one today. And our country is in jeopardy because of the leadership that is at the helm, not only here in America, but worldwide. World leaders have begun to pull back and shake their head at what is going on in America. We are no longer the go-to government in the world. So,
well, thank you so much, Ayesha. We have to stop the show now. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And if you come back to Chicago, I promise you Mississippi mud and Mississippi peanuts and everything. I mean, right next to my home, there is a trailer which comes in and they bring watermelon as well. So that's my regular place to go and get my watermelon and peanut supply. And he on his truck says in a big way, from the real Mississippi.
That's right.
I don't know, is Mississippi known for these things?
They're known for those things, and Chicago is known as North Mississippi.
Probably, because he sells out pretty soon in the season. There's a whole large trailer full of it, and it is gone in half of the season.
Well, we have to talk about the Great Migration. African Americans leaving the South started by the Chicago Defender newspaper. The Great Migration was the trains that were pulling up in Chicago.
Well, let's make it the topic of the next time we get you on our show, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayesha Mustafaa. It's a pleasure to have you on our Muslim Network TV. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, and Roku, and our own website, Muslim Network TV, as well as YouTube and Facebook. We are always there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep telling your neighbors. We are with them. Stand up for peace and justice, for the humanity of everyone around us. That will liberate our country from fear, hate, and anger, and we will continue to grow stronger and better.
Thank you.
Peace.